So most of these guys are things that we saw when we were making our camera layer. That means that once you've made your camera, you can always come down here and change a few things, such as all of these guys. There are some additional things that we're going to take a look at now. Before that, I will create a space between my two shapes. Let's change this to top view so I'm gonna hit R and reset my orientation. Do the same thing for shape number 2. Right click, reset. Then hit P on my shape 2 and move it way behind our red shape. This way I can show you guys better how the blur settings will affect our composition. We had our zoom, which is the distance between the distance from our lens to the image plane. If we bring it back, you can see that we're moving further away from our image. At the same time, we're also widening the angle from our lens. So you can use this to affect how your lens functions on the image plane. This right here is the image plane, which you can, by the way, change by hitting P, using Z to either go past your shapes or before your shapes. So that's what zoom does. I'm gonna bring it back to what I had, which is, I think it was like almost 2000 pixels. Then we have depth of field, which is going to introduce blurring for areas that are not in focus. Just like a real camera, we have the same options for aperture, focus distance, and blur level. When you turn this off, we no longer have the option to change our focus distance, aperture, and blur level. So this is what it looks like when it's turned off. When I turn it on, we get this second line, which basically determines the focus distance. So it's the distance from the camera to the plane and decides exactly what's in focus and what's blurred. So if I grab focus distance, you can see the second line is moving past my shapes. And when I pull it closer to the camera, it's going to go in front of my shapes. Right now, we're not really seeing a difference because I haven't changed my aperture and blur level. So to see this blurring effect better, I'm going to import an image and I'm going to place it underneath my shapes so we can see how we can blur out this image while keeping the shapes in focus. I'm going to hit P and move it behind my two shapes all the way in the back. So let's go back to our camera. I'm going to change my render into Classic 3D for this one. And when we increase our aperture, I have mine at around, I'm going to increase it even more, this much, 1140. Remember that this is pixels and not f-stops. So if you've used a real camera, you may be wondering why is the number so high. That's because we're working with pixels instead of f-stops. So when I increase my aperture, you can see that we're getting some blur. But my shapes are quite blurry compared to my background. That's because we have our focus distance set closer to our image rather than the shape. When I grab my focus distance backwards, maybe right on my image, I'm gonna get a sharp image while my shapes are blurry. When I bring it all the way back to our first image, everything else is blurry except the first image. So you can use focus distance paired with aperture and blur level to create this really nice depth of field. It's better to use a camera layer to create depth of field rather than a regular blur effect like Gaussian blur, camera lens blur, because this will give you a lot more freedom on how your blur looks and it gives a more natural blur effect. If you add to this, you're going to get a really blurry result, but if you remove from it, you will get a sharp result. Let's go back to 100. Then we have something called iris shape. This is the shape of your lens. By default, it's on fast rectangle, but this is not ideal for most projects because it gives a really odd looking blur. You may not see that big of a difference, but usually you want to keep your iris shape on one of the options down here, like an octagon. You can see this gives us a softer result. I like to go for a shape that has more sides. that will give me a softer look. So this is triangle right now, it's pretty sharp. This is fast rectangle, but octagon gives us a soft look. So depending on what you're doing, you would want to choose your iris shape. We have iris rotation, currently it's on 0%, but when you rotate this, it's rotating whatever shape you chose here, so it could give you a different look. But at a glance, you won't really see that big of a difference. We have iris roundness. Gonna zoom in on one of our shapes. The background, I mean. Turn this to 0. Go to triangle. It's going to round whatever shape you choose. So on triangle, which doesn't have that many sides, when I have it on 0, it's going to look like this. But when I increase it, we are getting a softer look because we're rounding the sides of our triangle. And we have a bunch of other options. These are all related to your lens. By default, you wouldn't really go past your iris shape unless you're doing something important. The next items we have are for the highlights that your lens captures. So when you increase the gain for your highlights, maybe reduce the threshold, you're getting more of those highlights brought into your lens, and therefore you'll get a result like this. When you increase the threshold, it's going to be more precise about what comes into your lens. So it looks pretty normal here. But when you reduce it, you're kind of opening the door for all of those highlights to glow inside. We can decide the gain of our highlights once they're inside. If you remove it to 0, you can see there are no highlights anymore. Bring it to 100. We're going to really intensify those highlights. You can also change the saturation of those highlights. If it's 0, it's going to be plain white. But if you increase it, you can get a nice blue color, which depends on what's in your picture. So because I have a lot of blue, it's going to make my highlight blue too. But if I set it to 0, I will get no saturation on my highlights. Now let's grab all of these options, right click and reset. So I get my original camera settings. And that's pretty much it when it concerns cameras. This was just a recap on what cameras are, because in the following lessons, we're going to use them quite often. So knowing what they are and what the settings are, it's going to help you understand the process a lot better. I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you in the next one.